welcome. Fantastic. Welcome. And fantastic to see you here at the Edinburgh Union. Oh, please take a seat, guys. No need to stand in ceremony. For those who have been here before, you know I waffle on and I don't want you guys to get tired. Welcome to the Edinburgh Union. Tonight's motion is this House has no confidence in NATO to solve modern security challenges. Against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine and ever more aggressive Russia, and especially with recent developments in Iran, more and more people have been asking whether NATO is effective anymore. Founded in 1945, the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance's resources, strategic unity, and diplomatic influence has been tested on multiple occasions throughout the years. But tonight's debate asks us whether NATO has effectively come and drawn up to the challenges that are faced by the modern day. And we are incredibly pleased to have such fantastic speakers with us today. And so, I would like to open the case for the proposition to welcome Jacob Neeson, a third-year politics student at the University of Edinburgh. Jacob, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. You have drafted the motion before us tonight with great perspicacity. For we meet at a moment when the character of global security is underpinned by a profound transformation. The return of war in Europe, as you articulate, the rising consequences of latent cyber conflict, economic coercion between major powers, one President Trump back again in the headlines, and the resurgent rivalry over critical security technologies all raise a fundamental question. Can the institutions designed to defend us in the 20th century remain sufficient for the security challenges of the 21st? Now, before any battle, we should lay out the rules of engagement. So let me do that by first defining the motion in three parts. First, when we speak of modern security challenges, what we mean is the expanding spectrum of threats that increasingly shape global stability, outwith of traditional military means by land, air, and sea. On the second point, when we speak of solving those challenges, we mean possessing the institutional capacity to address them in a comprehensive and sustained way. And third, and this is critical, third, to say that we have no confidence in NATO's ability to solve those challenges is not. It is not to deny NATO's historical success, but to recognise that the nature of security has evolved beyond the institutional design of a military alliance forged after World War II. This debate, therefore, is not about NATO's strength, it is about NATO's scope, on which security scholars have increasingly recognised that the nature of threats has expanded far beyond the battlefield. Security is understood no longer solely as protection from military attack, but as the capacity of states and societies to survive, to function, and to develop in the face of a wide spectrum of risks, not only in the military domain, but also in the political, economic, social, and environmental systems in which we all exist. And I'd like to share with you tonight two examples to make my case, although there are many more. Consider first the emergence of cyber conflict, securitized as a domain of strategic competition between states. Modern economies, increasingly so, depend on their digital infrastructures in ways that would have been unimaginable even a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades before. Financial systems, electricity grids, transportation networks, and even basic government administration now operate through those interconnected digital networks, raising a critical fault line in the international relations and security of states in the contemporary world. The security of a state, therefore, is increasingly separable from the security of those networks. We probably all remember in 2024 the CrowdStrike attacks. That just affected 8.5 billion devices, less than 1% of the world's devices. But imagine if Beijing, Pyongyang, and Moscow all put together their brains, which is not, alarmingly, an unrealistic premise, and targeted us in that way. And this vulnerability has already been demonstrated. In 2007, with striking clarity, Estonia, a NATO member state, was subjected to a sustained campaign of cyber attacks that disrupted its critical financial infrastructures, government ministries, media outlets, and public services. And these attacks did not involve the territorial invasion or deployment of conventional military force, upon which the institutional logic of NATO depends. But they did temporarily paralyse the significant parts of state infrastructure, demonstrating that latent and serious threat. And that raises an immediate strategic problem for a military alliance such as NATO. And the reason for that is that collective defence under Article 5 presumes a form of aggression that can be attributed, identified, and deterred through military response. Cyber conflict, in contrast, thrives on ambiguity. In fact, you may even say it's its raison d'etre. And attribution is difficult, responsibility is often plausibly denied, unlike conventional military warfare, and the threshold at which disruption becomes an attack, in the traditional sense, remains uncertain. In other words, a hostile actor can impose serious strategic costs without even triggering the conditions under which a military alliance is designed to operate. Now, that's talking about cyber conflict, but I also have a second point, which is also to do with networks. The second example concerns the growing importance of economic statecraft in contemporary international politics, particularly since the millennium, particularly 2001. Increasingly, we have observed that geopolitical power is exercised through financial systems, regulatory regimes, and indeed markets too. All of this terrain is shifting away from the battlefield, as I told you earlier. The Western response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I imagine, will be argued tonight. So let me approach it from a different angle. Alongside military assistance to Ukraine, governments coordinated sweeping financial sanctions, as you all know, to the tune of around $300 billion of Russian central bank assets, and restricted Russian banks' access to major international payment systems, CHIPS, SWIFT, and thereof. These measures significantly constrained Russia's ability to access foreign reserves, stabilise its currency, and conduct international trade, at least until Georgia got in the way and kind of moved that all up. Now, what is significant is that these measures were not implemented through NATO itself. NATO is not the locus of this security kind of coordination, because it has changed. They were coordinated through different finance ministries, the IMF, etc., the EU. So NATO now holds a different purpose, and it's very good at conventional deterrence, but indeed the terrain of modern security challenges has changed. And taken together, these examples reveal an uncomfortable truth. NATO, the sentinel of the West, stands vigilant against the tanks and battalions of old, but the most formidable battles of our age are waged in the shadows, against which the reach of a military alliance is but a flickering candle in a gathering storm. For instance, in recent years, just to give some context, hybrid campaigns in the Asia-Pacific have included persistent cyber intrusions. They've influenced operations for disinformation, etc., and economic pressure directed against Taiwan and other regional actors in the Asia-Pacific. And these tactics have complicated conventional defence, especially so if we consider that they may be transposed from the Asia-Pacific context to the European context. And such cases demonstrate the challenge facing NATO is not confined to Europe, but it is truly international in scope when we think about multilateral institutions as a whole. And therein lies our dilemma, Mr. President. Not whether NATO remains mighty, but whether its form, arguably frozen in the last century, can possibly encompass the boundless, borderless design of our age. In summation, this debate, as I told you earlier, is not about NATO's strength, but it's about NATO's scope. So times change, and we must change with them. And the tragedy of many great institutions within our history is not that they were weak, but that they were designed for dangers that had already begun to change, and they didn't keep up. And so therefore, in that respect, Mr. President, we must conclude tonight as a House, respectfully, soberly, but in terms resolute, begging for adaptation, that NATO, for all its historic achievements, is no longer sufficient to meet the full measure of modern security threats. Thank you.
much, Jacob. I've realised I have left something out that I should have mentioned earlier. When our wonderful debates officer rings the bell for the first time, that means, thank you, that means that the floor is open for points of information from anyone in the audience. If you'd like to give a point of information, which is simply a question, please either stand up or raise your hand or say clearly, point of information. The speaker will either choose to accept it, they can also choose for you to sit back down. It's perfectly within their right. Sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier, that's my apologies. Thank you very much. And now, I would like to welcome, to open the case for the opposition, Rainsy Ballard, a fourth-year history and politics student at the University of Edinburgh. The floor is yours.
Good evening. I would like to firstly thank the Edinburgh Union for hosting this debate. And I'd also like to thank all of you for attending. I know that with dissertations for those in fourth year fast approaching and set finals for those in other years as well, time can feel a bit strapped. So I really do appreciate you taking the time tonight to attend. Now, together tonight, we're going to be opposing the motion, "This House has no confidence in NATO to meet modern security challenges." So we're really hoping that at the end of the debate, you do march through one of the doors in favour of opposing the motion, believing that NATO can, in fact, meet today's modern security challenges. As has been stated, this debate is especially important in light of Russia's illegal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine in 2022. This has sparked the largest war in Europe since World War II. I'll begin by highlighting NATO's critical role in providing military assistance to aid Ukraine's self-defense, as I believe that demonstrates its effectiveness. I'm of course aware that while many of you recognize that from 2022 to 2024, NATO played a profoundly positive role in assisting Ukraine's self-defense, many of you are concerned of what President Trump's election victory means for the institution. I share many of those concerns and shall expand upon them later in my speech. Now, to begin with, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was established in 1949 to prevent military conflict. Article 5 stipulates that in the event of a member state being invaded, all other member states will come to its defense. Joining it was and is voluntary. It is a self-defense organization. As Jacob pointed out, there are other issues coming about in this century. But military security is increasingly an issue in the here and now. NATO is one of those institutions that promotes multilateral cooperation between states to work towards collective endeavor, because the only thing worse than working with allies is working without them. Now, NATO was designed to dissuade militarily powerful countries from invading weaker countries, as had happened in the run-up to World War II, until Hitler had been stopped by an alliance made up of the Allies. Now, the hegemon in 1949 that NATO sought to counter was, of course, the Soviet Union. Now, Jacob mentioned that following the Soviet Union's collapse, military spending and military conflict on Europe became less of a concern, and indeed, military spending was reduced across Europe. But now we have seen Russia has taken the form increasingly as a belligerent power in international relations, being willing to wage war on an unprecedented scale. So, NATO, I believe, is the antidote to such aggression. An argument you might hear tonight is that countries joining NATO after the Cold War represented some form of imperialist expansion. Indeed, you might hear that NATO is at fault for military insecurity by making Russia feel so militarily insecure that they just had to invade Ukraine. Now, with the greatest respect to that perspective, if you possess that view, you do get a free tinfoil hat. It is true that following the Soviet Union's collapse, many former satellite states of the Soviet Union, like Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, did make the choice to join NATO. That is a decision they made for themselves, based on an understanding of history, an understanding that Russia, which has for centuries invaded neighboring countries in an attempt to expand its borders, at the expense of the peace and prosperity of its neighboring countries, might do so again. That's why they made a decision as independent, sovereign states to join a bloc that defends their right to govern themselves. To those who say that is an act of aggression, it must be stressed that NATO would not support a member state that invaded Russia. It would only come to the defense and complete military defense of those countries that had been invaded by Russia. And quite frankly, those countries that chose to join NATO have been proven correct. If a known burglar moved next door, I might want to install a burglar alarm in my house. I would become increasingly more likely to install said burglar alarm system in my house if that person went up to me and said that me even thinking about installing the burglar alarm system was an act of aggression that they would feel compelled to respond in due course. Now, after all, what threat do burglar alarm systems pose to those who do not want to rob houses? NATO is that burglar alarm system. It is one of the strongest military defense alliances in history. Neither Russia nor the Soviet Union before it, nor China, has ever dared confront a NATO member state directly on the battlefield. For all this talk that NATO expansionism caused Russia to invade Ukraine, bear in mind that Russia has only invaded neighboring countries that have not been in NATO, whether it be seeking to annex 20% of Georgia's land in 2008, or seeking to illegally annex Ukraine's Crimea in 2014, and promoting military and political instability in Ukraine's Donbass region. Putin has not dared invade those countries to its border.
Is NATO also a burglar? What about Libya, Afghanistan, Serbia? Was that burglary as well?
Those wars were taken, each conflict is its own separate self. And yeah, look, we can quibble about various conflicts that NATO may or may not have been engaged in, but the fact remains that it was when we're focused on the Russia-Ukraine war, the war was one of self-defense, and NATO is helping protect Ukraine's independent statehood. Now, if I may go back to that, NATO has proven to ensure a deterrence capability by telling would-be dictators who would otherwise breach the peace that the cost of invading those countries that it might seek to, that are member states of NATO, would be so great that they are unlikely to come out on top. So the reason why Putin and no other military hegemon has invaded a country belonging to NATO directly is because they believe, they know at their heart of hearts, that they cannot win a war with NATO. It is this ability to persuade dictators not to invade its member states that proves that NATO can ensure a protected peace, a strong protected peace that I believe that people who are either in favor or against NATO support. Indeed, NATO's relevance is now clear more than ever, with previously non-NATO members like Finland securing accession in 2023 and Sweden securing accession in 2024. As we turn to the Russia-Ukraine war, I believe that NATO has proven to be an arsenal of democracy and freedom, with its member states providing Ukraine with the missiles, ammunition, guns, and intelligence required to counter what many perceived to be one of the strongest militaries in the world. It is for that reason that Russia, whose army we all thought was so mighty and would conquer and many thought would conquer Ukraine within weeks, if not days, has so far failed to do so. Now, of course, when discussing this war, there has to be a level of emotional intelligence and thinking and for the suffering faced by both those Russians and Ukrainians killed in the conflict. But it should be pointed out that if Putin had conquered all of Ukraine, he might already be invading his next country, and then another, as he whittled down his shopping list that he believed he required to construct his empire. Now, that has failed. The military conflict in Ukraine has been contained, gruesome and grotesque it is, and NATO is winning, and Ukraine as well. As such, I believe that NATO has proven up to the task of preventing powerful, authoritarian rulers from waging war on a scale similar to World War III. This, of course, leads one to consider how American President Trump's 2024 election victory impacts NATO. Now, of course, he has made comments that are extremely unhelpful towards the military alliance. Indeed, if he had gone to invade Greenland, as some suggested he might, I would probably be sitting in the booth for the proposition. But he did not. And European countries are stepping up. They are boosting military spending, exceeding the 2% GDP requirement that NATO requires to be spent on their militaries, enhancing the military cooperation that is needed in this day and age. And indeed, with regards to America, America continues to provide Ukraine with military intelligence that has proved crucial in this conflict. So, with NATO proving up to the task, I believe, of deterrence and ensuring a protected peace that its member states have, I ask you to please keep faith in this indispensable organization that we call NATO.
Thank you so much, Rainsy. And now, to continue the case for the proposition, I would like to welcome Mary Dejensky, a journalist, columnist, and broadcaster specializing in foreign affairs. She is particularly well known for her analysis of Russian and Western foreign policy, having served as the Independent's foreign policy correspondent in Moscow, Paris, and Washington. It is an honor to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be in Edinburgh. This is a mini escape from me, so I hope you find the brilliantly timed debate extremely interesting. I hope that the case that I'm going to make, that NATO is basically past it and useless, to put it in more vernacular form, that it complements the more theoretical and based on definitions of my previous speaker on my side. I've basically got 3 points to make. The first, which is really easy, I mean so easy that it's almost shameful to talk about it at all. But look at the war that has just broken out, that was begun by Trump and Netanyahu together. This is the biggest war that has affected really the world, not just the region, but it threatens far, far wider implications. Where has NATO been in this war? What relevance has NATO had from the beginning? None whatsoever. It's completely out of NATO's area, it's completely out of NATO's traditional or even maybe future adaptability. And this morning, what did we have? I woke up to hear President Trump say, where are all the NATO allies? Why aren't they coming to help us? Why aren't they going to help open the Straits of Hormuz to free up the passage of energy to the world? The answer is that not one of the NATO allies, starting with France, which I think was one that first rejected the idea, but Canada and then Britain sort of limped along a bit behind to say no, they wouldn't actually be joining this. So NATO is neither here nor there. It wasn't there at the beginning when Trump basically made a unilateral decision to attack Iran. And it's not there now because it's not even answering the call of President Trump to come to the aid of a war that, in my view, he started very foolishly. The second point, there was quite a lot by the previous speaker about the war in Ukraine. And I would like to take a completely different view of that from the NATO perspective, because I think the first point you can make about Russia-Ukraine war is that actually the fact that it began at all represents a colossal failure of deterrence. Now, deterrence, as we've heard, is at the basis of the way that NATO and the West in general treated both Russia and the Soviet Union before. The war in Ukraine, the fact that Russia was able to invade Ukraine, that it felt safe enough to invade Ukraine, or that its interests were so great that it had to invade Ukraine. That was a massive failure of Western deterrence, and don't let anybody persuade you otherwise, because deterrence has been at the basis of every Western attitude towards the East, and at a crucial time, it failed. Now, you might say, well, this is a very traditional war. It was a sort of war that NATO was actually set up to fight. But I actually disagree with one point that was made by the previous speaker, where he was actually wrong on a point of fact, which is that NATO as an alliance did not come to the help of Ukraine. What happened was that NATO did its absolute utmost in at least the first year, possibly the first 2 years of the war, not to look as though it was involved as an alliance. So all this hardware and finance that was being sent to Ukraine to support Ukraine against Russia, it wasn't coming from NATO. They set up a special sort of clearinghouse of volunteer countries, and then each amount of, especially military hardware that was sent, it was done on a bilateral basis. So Germany supplied certain things, the Brits supplied certain things, the French supplied certain things, the Americans supplied certain things. It was done on a national basis, and it was done on a national basis deliberately, because NATO wanted to take a back seat. It didn't want to hand Russia the argument that Russia was up against the might of NATO. And that is a factual point. But the thing is that in the last year or so, Russia's view, which was the same pretty much at the beginning, that it was fighting what it called a proxy war against NATO, that the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, has come out more and more vocally against Russia. And it's now possible to say, well, it's a proxy war as Russia presented it. But NATO is still not fighting on its own account. What you have is an extraordinarily perverse situation where, arguably, Ukraine, which is not a member of NATO and is unlikely to be a member of NATO in the foreseeable future, whatever its own desires are, that Ukraine has been beneficiary of something akin to an Article 5 protection in a way that no NATO country has actually either needed or benefited from. I think the only time that Article 5, that war against one is war against all, sort of, has been invoked was when was after 9/11. When some NATO countries that sort of argued that the US had come under attack, a terrorist attack. I wouldn't say that fell into the category of war, but that then Article 5 was invoked as saying that an attack on the US was an attack on the whole of NATO, and that the US could count on NATO support. But of course it never happened because that was a completely different sort of war. And when the war was waged on Afghanistan and then Iraq, and we had reference to Libya from the floor, NATO as an organisation, as an alliance, wasn't actually involved in any of these conflicts, at least at the beginning. Later on, there were some elements of NATO in Afghanistan, some elements of sort of cover given by NATO for Iraq. But the idea that NATO as a defensive alliance was fighting or an active part of any of these conflicts, that is simply not true. And you can follow that up by saying, well, even if it were, how successful was it? These were mostly colossal failures. So the third point I'd like to make is one of history, which considers really whether NATO has actually been successful or equal to the challenges at all since I would mark the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Since then, NATO has a colossal problem because it was set up to counter the Soviet Union and the Soviet Empire. When the Soviet Union collapsed, actually as Eastern Central Europe was throwing off communism between 1989 and 1991, what was happening was that the Warsaw Pact, which NATO was there, as it were, to counter, the Warsaw Pact was dissolved. Now, my argument would be that it would have made perfect sense for NATO to dissolve itself and to reconstitute itself in a form that was more suitable to what was currently going on in Europe. That didn't happen. So for the next decade, at least, NATO was casting around for some sort of purpose. It found a sort of new purpose when the newly independent countries of East and Central Europe wanted to join. But that, I would say, is a separate story, because that has been had a divisive effect both on the European Union, which we're not talking about here, but also on NATO, because the prime purpose of the new members was to counter what they saw as a threat from Russia. And the purpose of the old members of NATO, as of the European Union, was peace. I rest my argument here.
Thank you so much. Now, to continue the case for the opposition, I would like to welcome Dr. Benjamin Martel, a Senior Politics and International Relations Lecturer at the University of Edinburgh. And on top of his role at the university, he is also the Associate Director of the Edinburgh Europa Institute and also co-edits the Review of International Studies and Routledge's Contemporary European Politics series. It is a delight to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you all for coming out. What I want to do today is go back and think a little bit in the 10 minutes I have about some of the different kind of elements in the development of NATO. And I think I want to make two remarks across the very brief span of global history since 1949. The first is that as we've moved into an ever more changing world, NATO has been increasingly in demand rather than less in demand. And the second point is that essentially NATO has continued to exist not because it has been foisted on us by a militaristic United States, but because it has been prized out of the United States by allies and countries that we like more than the US. So, let me start with the Cold War origins. NATO is the most successful military alliance in world history, both in terms of longevity, but also in terms of arguably the peace that it has brought about, both between its members and within Europe, but also externally. The creation of NATO responded to demand from, back in the late 1940s, the British and the French seeking a continental commitment from the United States to the defence of Western Europe against the Soviet Union, which of course at that point the forces of the Red Army massed on in Central Europe. The security that NATO provided and that commitment, which became a model for many other regions of the world seeking a similar commitment, helped to undergird a process of European integration which, ironically, paradoxically, led to the fuzzy, nice civilian identity of the European Union that we have today, but also subsidised massively the European welfare state, which many of us benefited from. Not me, I was a child of Thatcher, but some in the room. In the post-Cold War world, NATO's continuity reflected not just organisational interests, we can't say that they didn't matter, but also specifically demand from those newly independent, formerly communist republics for a hedge against potential future aggression from Russia. And as such, was in significant demand from the new members who wanted to join, but also from the Europeans for whom facing the new wars associated with the violent breakup of many of the regimes across Europe sought an alliance or a platform for shared operations that would work. And it was Europe's failure in the Balkan Wars, and in particular in Bosnia, that effectively led to that demand for NATO, which we saw in Kosovo. Efforts to establish European alternatives, which we saw in the late 1990s, that was the origins of the European Security and Defence Project, are very often seen as alternatives to NATO. In fact, they were nothing of the sort. the big turnaround came from Tony Blair's government and a desire to address some of the burden-sharing issues and essentially to provide for a means of Europeans to act in order to keep the transatlantic alliance going and to diminish risks that the Americans would think it wasn't in their best interests. Had Britain have Brexited beforehand, I have no doubt that we would instead have had a European pillar of NATO rather than the CSDP that we have today. I'll say a little bit about Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but a lot has already been touched on. I think the invasion has reflected essentially, I don't think it was NATO's fault, and I don't think it was any surprise that NATO didn't rush to the defence in an obvious way that would have led to escalation of a non-NATO member. This was made very clear in a run-up before the invasion. I think Putin's remarks about encirclement by NATO are disingenuous. We know that in the years running up to the invasion, he was surrounded increasingly by his siloviki, the security services, whom he mainly saw during COVID, increasingly became isolated from those in the foreign ministry who were pushing for greater interdependence and more engagement with Europe, and essentially came to share a very hawkish view of the world and view of Europe, which has shaped, some may argue, warped his thinking. NATO has been very significant in terms of its response to the full-scale invasion through the Ukraine Defence Contact Group, through the provision of funds, through policing the airspace and defending those members which are within the alliance. NATO's role has been limited by a desire to avoid undue escalation. Where this has been the case, the European Union has in many cases stepped in, and what has emerged in recent years is a very productive division of labour which is hitherto unseen between the civilian and the military sides of Brussels. It is notable, if one went on the NATO website just after the invasion, that most of the things that they listed were essentially EU competencies. Far from being alternative platforms for deployment, essentially now to European countries, there's a productive division of labour, and you need to be utilising both institutional frameworks to help Ukraine. I'll say a little bit also about the elephant in the room, Donald Trump. Trump's challenge to NATO, I think, has been significant. NATO has, however, survived one Trump. It can, I believe, survive another. Trump's challenge to NATO has been principally concerned with redressing what he regards as unfair burden sharing. He does it in a particularly crass way, but in so doing highlights issues that were also concerns going back to through successive presidents and were made very obvious also by the Obama presidency. The irredentist challenge to Greenmark, not the alliance's best moment, similarly seems to have been motivated more by some ill-thought-out version of hard bargaining, whereby Trump would get the allies, by threatening to do something so unbelievably ridiculous, Trump would essentially get the allies to pay more, again, for the defence of the high Arctic for the US. What we're seeing is hard bargaining rather than genuine geostrategic fighting between alliances. And yet Trump may still prove fatal to NATO. I cannot guarantee that the alliance will withstand Trump 2.0 and its unconstrained elements. What I can say, however, is that if Trump leads to the demise of NATO, the members will try to create something that looks awfully similar to NATO. Try to recreate the alliance in some form, and they will do so using the platforms, standards, capabilities, and headquarters which already exist. Trump's challenge to the allies in the Strait of Hormuz, I agree, is out of area, but I think highlights underneath the significance of NATO and is seen as leverage precisely because it's what the Europeans effectively want to guarantee. Because they want to keep NATO going, because they believe in it significantly, it is effectively leverage that Trump, again crassly, can deploy. So just to summarise, NATO has withstood many challenges before. It can continue to withstand them. It has emerged stronger out of a changing world because there is significant demand and fundamentally no alternative. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, what we are going to do is have a quick 10-minute break. After that break, we will be having floor speeches from you guys in the audience. So if you would like to say something, please take this 10 minutes to think about it, maybe jot it down on your phone. It's completely allowed. However, do note we have a Q&A section after the final two speakers. So if you want to ask a question, hold it on till then. 10 minutes, guys. See you in 10. Welcome back. I hope you all had a chance to mull over what you might like to say. Do we have anyone who would like to give a floor speech? I saw a hand go straight up there.
Thank you. As a Ukrainian myself, I have been asking this question for the last 4 years. If Ukraine would have been in NATO, would this barbaric invasion have taken place? When I have woken up from explosion and be forced to take refuge in Europe, with the doubts if I will ever get to see my house again. However, in recent years I have grown more confident NATO would not offer the protection from justified aggression, and every day I'm growing more confident in this opinion. The ultimate fact that I have to worry about my friends and relatives daily is strong enough to convey that NATO did not protect Europe from Russian aggression. The ultimate fact that when we are talking about whether we should put trust in NATO, there are people dying in my country, is just enough to show that NATO can be trusted to solve modern security issues. Thank you.
I saw a hand that was over there, yes.
Hello, everybody. I have a fairly simple view on this matter, so I'll try and be as brief as possible. It seems to me that the proposition sort of view of a ghost NATO, a NATO which doesn't quite exist, and is supposed to do all these things that NATO isn't doing, and therefore NATO has failed. Why isn't NATO opening these trade reform routes? How is NATO allowed the war in Iran to go on? How, in fact, is NATO allowed the war in Ukraine to occur in the first place and to continue to the present day? And I think that's probably a very compelling view of NATO if you're the President of the United States, and you wonder why it is that you aren't paying for the defence of those European countries when they don't do a single thing for you. But I would argue that in real life, the real NATO is a defence alliance. The purpose of NATO is to prevent all the countries in NATO from being invaded by any hostile actor, and if they aren't to be invaded, to repel them. And in that matter, NATO has succeeded completely. It has succeeded in the past, it has succeeded now, and I wager it would succeed in the future. The only meaningful challenge I see to that view of NATO, the defensive view of NATO, would be if the United States were to go their own way to remove their defensive umbrella and leave Europe on its own. But even in such a dire circumstance, which I would argue is very unlikely, with multiple nuclear armed states in Europe alone, such a NATO going its own way, I think, would still be able to manage its purpose as a defensive alliance. That's my view of it.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else who would like to speak? No problem. Excellent. We will get on to our final two guest speakers. So, to continue the case for the proposition, I would like to welcome Sophie Johnson, the Secretary of the Stop the War. The Secretary of Stop the War Scotland, a role that's placed her at the heart of anti-war campaigns in Scotland, and she's also a columnist for the Scottish digital media platform Conta Scott. Sophie, it is wonderful to welcome to your Edinburgh Union. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Look, if I was standing here even a year ago today, I would be saying very different things about NATO. I would be arguing against the fact that people have always said that NATO is a defensive alliance. I would be pointing to Kosovo and the civilian bombings that took place there. I would be pointing to NATO's wars of aggression in Libya, the 20-year-long occupation of Afghanistan and the disasters that these caused. I would be talking maybe about NATO expansion eastwards how it broke the end of the Warsaw Pact and played a role in the circumstances that led to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But the funny thing about this period is that I no longer need to say these things. Not because they're not true, because they are true, but because the central point has actually already been made for me. Last week, the General Secretary of NATO himself described the alliance in these terms, and I quote, "NATO is a platform for the United States to project power on the world stage. Not, in fact, a defensive alliance, or anything else, in fact. And this is something the anti-war movement, people like me, have been saying for a very, very long time indeed." But the second point I want to make is something that should be even more obvious than this. As violent and horrific as US power has been over the last 20, 30 years, and it has been that, it is not operating as business as usual in the present. Let me put it like this. We have become used to a period where the United States has actually operated as almost undisputed world power on the world stage. That was the period that became known as the rules-based order, and with that period came a couple of things, a series of rules and norms, always hypocritically enforced, I would argue, but rules and norms nonetheless, and a series of institutions and alliances that underpin that order. NATO was part and parcel of that period. But what Trump represents is not, as yourself has argued, just a blip, but a sign that we have moved quite dramatically from one era into the next. The United States can no longer sustain its former position as world leader. We need only to look to China for evidence of that fact. We are in an era where the rules-based order no longer appears legitimate. We only need to look to Gaza to make that case. And we are in an era where, as a result of these shifts, an institution like NATO is actually rapidly becoming incoherent. And we are seeing this in real time. In 2026 alone, the United States has threatened to attack not one but two NATO allies. It has threatened Denmark over Greenland, and just a few weeks ago, it actually threatened Spain over use of its military bases. You cannot pretend these things have not happened. Yesterday, the United States even warned NATO allies that they were looking at a very bad situation indeed in the future if they did not do exactly as he said in Iran. And if the opposition still want to bury their head in the sand about the nature of the times we are living in, then let me ask them this. Why do you think Mark Carney, the President of Canada, the Prime Minister of Canada, made a speech to world leaders at Davos this year where he said in the clearest possible terms that the rules-based order is over and that it actually never existed? Because he is telling people that the world as it has been described to us up until this point, the one that people, I'm sure, will make the case still exists today, the one of defensive alliances, the one of moral legitimacy on the part of the United States, is totally over. The only thing left over from that period is a raw and volatile power, one that the opposition would have us be tied to. This is how we must understand the fact, for example, that the United States no longer bothers with the moral appendages it used to use when it carried out wars of aggression. It did not, for example, bother with any humanitarian justification when it went for Venezuela and abducted its president. They told us, actually, that this was about oil. They didn't do that in Iraq. With the war in Iran that is taking place as we speak, again, they made it clear that they would not be abiding by international law at all when they said there would be no more stupid rules of engagement. That is what Pete Hegseth, the US Secretary of War, said. They are making it as clear as possible to us, for everyone to see, that the world the opposition believes in no longer exists. And we cannot go backwards. because there's also a structural basis for this. We cannot go backwards because, quite simply, the United States can no longer maintain its role as world hegemon. This is why the United States has ripped up its sprawling network of international aid from across the world. That is why it is tearing up the Mutual Security Pact by threatening its allies right now. This is why it now openly carries out negotiations with Russia in its own interests without a word from its allies, without even pretending. This is why NATO is being used as a tool actually to demand extraordinary amounts of money on defence that we will be asked to pay for. That is why it's demanding that that money is spent on American weapons and American contracts. And if we accept, as Mark Carney has said, that there has been a rupture, then the only question that remains for us is, what do we want the future to look like? Do we want to be bound to this process, bound to the United States through something like NATO, or do we want something different? Unfortunately, our leaders so far have decided to pursue the former. They've tried to cozy up to Trump in the hopes of gaining favour. Who on earth can say that that has worked? It's not, for example, exempt us from tariffs, quite the opposite. It is allies, not traditional enemies, that are facing the brunt of these measures. And when Starmer made the decision 2 weeks ago to offer up our air bases for the war on Iran, who can say that that was a good idea? Not only has Trump humiliated him on social media, but Starmer now has to explain to us why we have been dragged into a US war of aggression which everyone here surely knows is illegal. Why has he made us targets for any blowback from this war, a war that has already taken thousands of lives? Why was this war a good idea when the cost of living is shooting up and we may well be facing a recession from the consequences? That is the reality of United States power in this era. So I want to end on this point. People in this country are sick and fed up of war. They have been horrified by this war in Iran, just as they were horrified by the genocide that took place in Gaza. And they are horrified at the way that the United States is acting on the world stage. They want absolutely no part of it. Ask anyone, they do not want to be part of it. And they are ready for something different. What the opposition is asking of us today is to have confidence in the United States, pure and simple, a power that no one else has confidence in. That is what NATO means. That is what we're really talking about today, and that is why I urge you to vote for the proposition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie. And now, to continue the case for the opposition, I would like to welcome Dr. Leila Aliyeva, an associate at Oxford School of Global and Area Studies and a senior fellow at Friends of Europe. She's an expert on Russia-Western relations, the politics of energy and democratization in post-Soviet Eastern Europe, having been a fellow of the NATO Partnership for Peace Programme and writing papers for NATO's Defence College. It is a pleasure to welcome you to the Edinburgh Union, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be and to speak here. I fully agree with the previous two remarks from the audience, although they seem to be a bit contradictory, but they in fact show the complexity of the issue we're discussing. First of all, I would like to stress that the role and future of NATO, as any domestic and international institution nowadays, should be assessed according to its ability to adjust to quickly changing international relations, nature and dynamics of power and security threats. For most of the institutions, and it's not just NATO, it's a challenging issue as the world has entered and undergo changes of extreme speed, substance, and scale, unprecedented scale. Among factors which affect this peculiarity of this particular historical moment is complexity of the new world. It's multilateral order moving away, as just the previous speaker said. Energy transition, AI and IT, and respectively specific dynamic of nature of power threats, leading to the multi-level and multi-dimensional character. Energy transition will be characterized by a variety of contradictory trends: centralization and decentralization, regionalization of power dynamic due to the electricity connectivity on the one hand. On the other hand, you will still have a topical, critical minerals and renewables, and all of them are leading to different dynamic and different type of threats. We also, similarly, AI and IT will also lead to very different and sometimes contradictory trends. For instance, on the one hand, they will empower the non-state actors, allowing decentralization, while at the same time having a capacity to centralize of power and sources of threats. Hybrid nature of warfare and threats, when military and non-military means are often mixed and require more complex institutions to address them. Hybrid threats create challenges for the policy response, as they often blur the boundary between external and internal sources of threats. Taken into account of peculiarity of this historical period and multi-level, multi-dimensional changes, transformation of most of the institutions is quite natural. NATO, on the one hand, can be assessed as a successful example of a defense alliance of democratic states, which so far played an important role in deterrence, both inside since 1949 and outside the alliance, cooperation and standardization, political stability. Besides the model of defense organization, it has been an important instrument for reform and transformation, peacekeeping and crisis operations in other regions. I will tell you an example of my own experience when I was running projects as a director of the think tank back in the Caucasus, in particular in Baku, Azerbaijan, and how important was perception of NATO, participation in its projects on democratic governance of the security sector by the top level of commanding level of the armed forces in our countries. NATO has been responding by creation of certain departments, institutions, centers within its own structures to get adjusted to these new demands and new requirements. For instance, in 2025, NATO defense ministers agreed on new capability targets, which needed increasing defense spending, created new coalition on support for Ukraine, Euromagnetic Warfare Capability Coalition, one of a few such coalitions which are trying to cooperate and help Ukraine to defend itself from Russia. For addressing hybrid threats, strategic concept of NATO states, that hybrid operation against allies could reach the level of armed attack and may invoke the Article 5. EU also recognized hybrid threat in its strategic compass. The cooperation between EU and NATO advanced For instance, one of the examples is Hybrid Center of Excellence, which helped to increase shared awareness of hybrid threats. In the war of Russia and Ukraine, NATO promoted the country's resilience by significant aid and cooperation. NATO supports Ukraine's fundamental right to self-defense and is coordinating the delivery of aid from allies and partners. Since 2022, NATO allies have been providing Ukraine with unprecedented levels of military assistance, delivering billions of euros worth of equipment, supplies, training, and other critical support. Taken into account the unique capacity and experience of NATO and its structures to deter, respond to the threat, most importantly, its ability to adjust to the unprecedented speed and scale of the contemporary changes in international relations. In spite of the challenges in regards transatlantic relations, in timely addressing non-military threats, NATO can serve the basis for the future transformation. The question is whether NATO, as uniquely equipped defense structure, will transform towards greater Europeanization, regionalization, or will overcome the geographic borders and move towards greater universalization, which means that it will reach out the democracies in the other parts of the world, like AUKUS, for instance, regardless of the geographical region where it's located? Or will NATO incorporate both of its elements? Because the organization might also have a few levels, both regional and more universal or trans-regional. So we still are in the process of development, dynamic, and transformation. And for that, for the outcome, we need to continue to critically observe what's happening within NATO and how whether it's effective or not. One thing, however, I would add that this will also require terminology changes, greater use of the term accession than of enlargement, thus stressing the agency of the member or aspiring countries rather than alliance, and decreasing the realpolitik perception of this alliance and manipulation by the process by the dictators. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all of our speakers this evening. We are now moving on to the Q&A session, so if you have a question for either the proposition or the opposition, please raise your hands. Oh, right at the front.
Thank you. I wrote it down. The second, this is a question for the opposition. The second speaker mentioned that with regard to the war in Ukraine, NATO as an organisation has not been especially useful through direct involvement. Instead, member states have individually supplied aid weapons to Ukraine. I would ask, since NATO has allowed member states in a coordinated effort to supply a key NATO ally, without forcing escalation by sending all the armies of Europe to fight and die in the fields in Ukraine, is this not an example of NATO adapting the strategy to suit a modern security challenge and prevent global escalation?
Can I just double check with you? Was that for the proposition?
Proposition.
No, that's right. I believe that was directed towards yourself.
Do I come?
Oh yeah, that'd be fantastic.
Well, thank you very much for the question. I actually will answer in completely the negative, because it seems to me that the purpose of an alliance is to be an alliance. It's not to have an a la carte sort of opt-in, opt-out. And if you are going to be an alliance, then you should be actually proud and upfront about being an alliance and not sort of shrinking into the background because you're worried that being there and doing what you're doing is going to inflame the other side and escalate things. So I sort of reject the premise. If you have an alliance, you have an alliance, and everybody pays in, and everybody. The reason that alternative system structure was set up was partly not to escalate, but it was also because there was no actual unanimity on the part of alliance members about what they should do. And that persists to this day, as we see with this, the coalition of the willing that sort of floated in and out of NATO consciousness, but actually has come to nothing so far. Thank you.
Would the opposition like to respond? You don't have to. No, that's okay. Does anyone else have a question? Ooh. Thank you at the front.
Thank you. This is a question for the opposition. So a lot has been made of Donald Trump and kind of the threats that he kind of poses to the alliance. What's your prescription for NATO if it is to continue existing, to kind of navigate this, and what do you think would be the best way for them to accomplish this to remain viable?
Thank you for that question. I think a common, a very sad thing when it comes to Trump is that as a result of his various actions and disgraceful comments, many people assume that Trump is America and that America is Trump. That is not the case. There are a lot of people in America that oppose him. He will not be president forever. He will not be running for a third term, despite what some of his apparatchiks say. America maintains a democratic system. So the prescription essentially is to do what they're sort of already doing, to run down the clock. Trump has about 8 more months until the midterms, in which case the tariffs, which have increased the cost of living of Americans, will result in a democratic wave in the Senate and House of Representatives. If not, 2 years later, it is increasingly likely that a Democratic president will take over. So the trick now is to just act forcefully in private and in public, sort of continue what you're doing, maintain that sort of strategic ambiguity. Unfortunately, that's the sort of prescription you have to do, just play for time. Thank you.
I'll give a brief response, if I may. Play it for time. What time? All it takes is one missile and hundreds of lives lost. So unfortunately, I don't think we have time. I don't think that's a good strategy, and that's why I urge you to vote in favour of the proposition tonight. Because only by addressing the deficits in NATO can we actually solve the problem. Thank you.
I can see a hand right at the very back. Sorry, Lucy, that's all a while away.
Actually, I have different questions for proposition and opposition. So for proposition, I think I heard a couple of things that to me seemed a little contradictory from across the speakers, where from one, I'm getting this argument that NATO is an extension, an expansion of US power, and on the other, I'm getting, well, when it comes to a lot of conflicts, such as what we're seeing right now in Iran, NATO actually hasn't had much to do with that. And if it was an expansion of US power, it would seem as if NATO member states would be involved more forcefully in what's happening there. And then for opposition, I think one thing that proposition brought up that wasn't really addressed was the issue of
start with a question to the proposition.
Thank you. So, as I said, it's not just me that has admitted what NATO is. It's the General Secretary of the United States. And I suppose what I was trying to get across is that in the period that we have just lived through, that is exactly what NATO has been. It has been an arm of the United States, and it has acted in various ways across the world using NATO. But we are now in a period that is very, very different, in which the United States is beginning to act in an increasingly volatile way, and as it is doing so, it is ripping up, quite deliberately I would argue, the mechanisms that it used in the past. And it is doing that with NATO as we speak. It is causing chaos with NATO. But more fundamentally, it is still using NATO in a very direct way. The United States is still using NATO in a very direct way. It is using NATO to threaten its allies, actually. It is saying if you don't do this, then NATO will be over. It is saying if you do not give us lots and lots of money for defence spending, then NATO will be done. And it is using NATO, but in a very different way. It is using NATO as a threat against its allies as well as against the world, as opposed to just against the world in the past. So that was what I was trying to get at, I think.
If the opposition, yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much. I'll just very quickly talk to the point about cybersecurity. And I'm not a cybersecurity expert, so two quick points here. So one is, I think, what's really interesting about the really prominent cyber attacks like the 2006 one in Estonia is precisely that they show the irritation that Putin had about the eastward expansion of NATO and Russia's inability to do anything about it except minor distributed denial of service attacks, right? I mean, so the regime got really, really annoyed that it hadn't managed to preclude the enlargement and then was faced with, by the consensus of most political scientists, nothing much that it could do except minor irritants or small drones. And I appreciate that the world of cybersecurity has changed very much since then, but I see it rather, instead of a new threat, as essentially a sign of weakness on behalf of Russia at the time. Secondly, I just invite us to ask, I mean, you know, cybersecurity is difficult because it's obviously something which is a divided competence. It was never something that NATO was going to do. NATO has working groups on cybersecurity. It's much more closely related to what the EU does. The EU is becoming more of an actor that's more important here. And I suspect that what we're going to see coming out of the increased post-Ukraine EU-NATO coordination is much more closer work on the cyber domain. I would just ask you to consider what you would rather have in this domain. Is a return absent NATO or absent an EU getting involved in security to essentially bilateral cooperation? Ain't working so well after Brexit with the UK and other countries, or an organisation which at least where you have the infrastructure, the headquarters, the institution, which is starting to take it more seriously. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. With respect to America's dominance of NATO, I think the saying goes, it's been a long time since I did GCSE history, when America coughs, the whole world catches a cold. And we're all feeling that illness right now in NATO. With respect to your question, you almost phrase it as a binary. So if I may, I'll challenge the premise of the question, in that we have a spectrum of US dominance with regards to NATO. But as Mary has said, we should be an alliance. And an alliance does indeed have graded hierarchies, But the graded hierarchy right now, with Trump's kind of unilateral movements and so forth, are absolutely embarrassing, and they are not solving modern security challenges. And to move back to the more specific point of your question, I think when we see another president, well, actually, let's talk historically, let's not predict the future, I'm not that good. When we look at the past, we have broadly seen very similar patterns. But Trump is a special case. President Trump is a special case because I think the first student speaker mentioned a burglar alarm. Now, raise your hands if you've ever used a burglar alarm to prevent your neighbours from coming in your house. No one. You must have grown up where I did, and for that I'm very sorry. Near the train station, it was bad, right? Yeah. So what we've got is a wholesale degradation of the whole kind of purpose of NATO and its founding. And it's frankly ridiculous. So this is an extreme case, but it is a replicable case. And if you look at the kind of the trend, if you will, I mean, we've seen it, let's talk about Bush, and when we went cap in hand with Bush, and in response to the activation of Article 5 with regards to Iraq and Afghanistan post 9/11, we have been dragged along, cap in hand with America, but that needs to change. And my last point is, I think Dr. Marta mentioned, about that kind of stuff as well. We've also seen a kind of reluctance as well with the coalition of the willing as an alternative slightly to NATO. So, yes, US presidents are dragging us along. Trump's an extreme case, and that's going to end up fracturing the alliance. Thank you.
I saw a hand pop up earlier. Yes, fantastic. And then we'll come to you as well. Sorry, just while Lucy's at the back.
So, given the prompt of this debate itself regarding confidence in NATO's ability to solve modern security challenges, I found this debate has strayed substantially beyond actual NATO member states regarding conflicts in Ukraine and the Persian Gulf. As contained strikingly few remarks regarding the contemporary security challenges that Russia poses to modern NATO members. While we did just discuss cybersecurity, Russia has employed a range of approaches to wield its sharp power, such as hybrid and gray zone conflict. In September 2025, 19 Russian drones entered Polish airspace, which was shortly followed by Russian planes entering Estonian airspace and a Russian drone flying into Romania. Regarding contemporary security challenges such as this, the cutting of underwater cables in the Baltic, and Russian support for far-right populist movements across the US and Europe, I'd like to hear from both sides regarding their confidence in NATO's ability to deal with these emerging hybrid threats. Thank you.
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I just couldn't hear you very well. I'm not too good at hearing, I'm so sorry. Just a little bit slower if that's okay.
Regarding contemporary hybrid and gray zone threats, such as Russia testing the waters by flying drones into Polish airspace, or cutting undersea cables in the Baltic, or supporting far-right populist movements in Europe, to what extent do you have confidence in NATO to deal with these modern challenges regarding NATO members itself, not Ukraine, not the Gulf?
Yeah, okay.
NATO members themselves. Thank you.
No, good question, thank you. I suppose let's bring in a couple of things. You mentioned the kind of Polish border, and I presume that you were referring to Operation Eastern Sentry. That was when a Russian drone entered Poland, didn't really get shot down, and it entered into Polish airspace. We talked about earlier, we had from the lady from the opposition, a measure of an institution. And the measure of an institution's capacity is the rate at which it can adapt, in the words of the opposition, to new threats. Drone warfare is one of these new threats. And I would say it was a failure of NATO as an institution to not be able to stop that from happening. We talked about terminology, let me call that a failure loud and clear. With regards to some other aspects that you mentioned with regards to grey zone threats and hybrid warfare, that is the essence of my opening speech. And I will remind you of some of the remarks that I made around the inadequacy and the operationability of Article 5. Because Article 5 is the keystone of NATO, and when you have a hybrid warfare threat, such as cyber attacks, how do you attribute, identify and retaliate, if not in military means? And this means for us on the proposition that actually NATO cannot solve modern security challenges, because NATO can be very good at conventional warfare. It can be very good at kind of deterring armies and so forth in NATO member states. But it is not an institution that is aligned for the kind of rebuttal and the deterrence of those more hybrid threats, as you rightly articulate. And that is why I also urge you to vote for the proposition tonight, because otherwise any other case is completely analytically incoherent.
For the opposition? No. No? Okay.
I mentioned it, yes. I mentioned it in my speech, so
I'm glad we agree.
Yeah.
It's nice when we find agreement here at the Edinburgh Union. Is there any... Oh, yes, there's the question just there. Sorry, it's second row, Lucy.
Thank you. I have a question for the opposition, which is a rather simple one. If NATO is not equipped to deal with modern security issues, what would you propose as an alternative?
Thank you. So the motion tonight, first of all, does not ask of me to consider an alternative. I'm not clever enough or wise enough to design an institution. NATO tried, and NATO failed. And I'm not as clever as they are. I can tell you that much. It wasn't the brains that got me here. But I can tell you this. I can tell you that the nature of modern security threats is increasingly fragmented. Increasingly fragmented means that we have to have unique specialisms of different kinds of capabilities, for example, cyber warfare, economic sanctions, etc. We might look at the environmental aspects of security. We might look at migration flows or human trafficking, those kind of new kind of things that have entered into the IR canon. And with that regard, I would actually again challenge the premise of the question. What we need is a set of institutions to deal with those, outside of bilateral agreements of states. For example, a good one is Five Eyes. That's one example that already proves that we can do that without a wholesale military alliance. These Five Eyes is an excellent intelligence sharing service, because where you've got so many kind of threats now, if you try to merge those into one institution, that institution is going to be too slow, and it's not going to be able to keep up with the nature of those threats. It's going to be too big and it won't be agile, so it won't be effective. So in terms of designing a new institution, I can have a think about it, but it might take me some years, but I can tell you that it wouldn't be like NATO.
Thank you so much. I dodged the hybrid warfare question, so I wanted to come in on this briefly. I think the question of what would replace NATO is a really, really interesting one. And I think I'll just go back to some of the remarks that I made earlier, which is that I think it would look really, really similar to NATO, right? I think it would involve almost the same members, potentially minus the United States or minus the present United States. I think would involve many of the same ideological fault lines, right? My colleague on this bench talked earlier about the different kind of countries, think Japan, think Australia, that have tried to get closer in terms of their cooperation with NATO. And more fundamentally, all of the alternatives, quote unquote, that we have to NATO, think about emphasis on European strategic autonomy, fundamentally rely on what it is that NATO has created, right? Which is the interoperable militaries based on a significant proportion of spending of GDP on modernizing those militaries within Europe. So what look like alternatives to NATO are essentially just NATO revisited, NATO in different bottle. Thanks.
Fantastic, and thank you all for those questions. We will now move on to summation speeches before we go on to voting. So, I would like to welcome Rainsy Bernard to summarise the case for the opposition. Rainsy, you have 5 minutes to
Good evening. Thank you so much for attending the debate. Thanks again for that. So this evening we are trying to make the case that we do have confidence in NATO to meet today's security challenges. Now, I get that we are defending an imperfect status quo, and all of these people from the proposition certainly raised valid points. But I have to highlight something that I think one of the former people who spoke and asked the question highlighted. There's a complete and utter disconnect between the argument that the proposition is making. One of them seems to argue that there are challenges like cybersecurity and other challenges raising, somewhat paradoxically arguing that NATO should perhaps develop greater competencies in this regard. Another argues that NATO's failure to deter Russian aggression in Ukraine proves NATO is a failure. On this, I have perhaps some sympathy in the sense that I very much believe that Eastern European countries like Ukraine should have been quickly accepted into the institution. NATO gets that. That's the reason why Finland was allowed to join NATO in 2023, and Sweden secured accession in 2024. And the other one, the last speaker, speaking for the Stop the War Coalition, raised a very clear point about a case for NATO being an instrument of the United States for their various actions. And that is something I also have sympathy for. But I have to highlight that there is no plan for the alternative. Indeed, the proposition Jacob for the proposition made the case that Five Eyes was an institution that could work in place of NATO. I have to ask how that might have rested well with the Stop the War campaigner, as America is a part of Five Eyes. This is completely what we saw with the Brexit mess, where a group of people, for various reasons, opposed being in the EU. And once they left, they had no plan. The case here that this House has no confidence in NATO to meet modern security challenges, the thread weaving that together is the belief that NATO should just not exist. So I get that while we are arguing for an imperfect status quo, we have offered a case that NATO certainly acts as a basis for the cooperation between like-minded countries who want to protect each other and ensure a strong peace between themselves. That multilateralism, that cooperation, is something that NATO has successfully and is striving towards. So, for that reason, I do ask you to oppose the motion that this House has no confidence in NATO. Thank you.
Summarise for the proposition.
Thank you very much. First of all, congratulations to all speakers, both here and on the floor for your speeches. Everybody tonight has spoken with intelligence, lucidity, and precision. I can't say that word. I could when I had it written down in my speech. And have been very articulate in their views. Now, I spoke at the start of my opening speech about defining the motion. But really, I could just ask you 4 words. Do you feel safe? Do you? Do you? No. Do you? No. Those 4 words can summarise the 2 hours of debate that we've had. Because if NATO can solve modern security challenges, you wouldn't have done that. You wouldn't have shaken your head. You wouldn't have shaken your head. Not a single person nodded their head. Nobody feels safe. And that's for a plethora of reasons. We've heard from the opposition tonight that NATO has been effective at deterring Russia. Well, no, it's not, because Russia is increasingly close to NATO borders. So no, it's not. We've also heard that NATO is in more demand than ever. Well, that's true, but it's not in supply. It's really not in supply because we can see how it's being fractured. We can see how the coordination of a military alliance is failing us because we don't feel safe. And on behalf of the proposition, we have heard lucid and eloquent arguments as well. We have heard from Sophie about how America is leading us and throwing us into conflicts that we should not be going into. Nobody wants that. Hundreds and thousands of people have voiced their concerns about this. We have also heard from Mary tonight about the failure of NATO, about the relevance of NATO in Iran, where it shouldn't even be, but then Trump is trying to drag us along by the tail and get us into a war that we don't want. Because NATO cannot solve that modern security challenge. It cannot solve the Middle East. And this is wrong with the logic of our leaders, where they try to project their power, outwith their capacity, when at home and in Europe there are far bigger concerns to have. And also, we heard from Mary on Russia and Ukraine, that the fact that it began at all is a failure of deterrence. Because again, it hasn't worked. And then we heard also from the opposition about alternatives to NATO. We heard at one point that there was no alternative to NATO. But then we heard that there were alternatives to NATO that might look like NATO. And then we heard that there were alternatives because NATO is working with the EU with NATO. That's not the policy of Mark Rutte. That's the policy of Vicky Pollard. Yeah, but no, but yeah, but no. So in conclusion tonight, modern security challenges fall outside of NATO's remit. We have all agreed that NATO is a defence organisation. It cannot solve those wider global issues of economic warfare, of decreasing militarisation for a more peaceful world. It cannot solve the problems of environmental disaster, which are a security issue, a modern security issue. It cannot solve them. So when you walk through the lobby tonight, think of those 4 words. Do you feel safe? Thank you.
Jacob, and you're mentioning the lobby provides me a wonderful segue into talking about the vote. Now, here at the Edinburgh Union, we vote with our feet through these 2 doors. If you would like to vote for the proposition, please exit through the door at the back. If you would like to vote for the opposition, please go through the door here. Your vote will be counted as you go through the door. The vote will also be announced at the library bar in Teviot, which we will all be heading to afterwards. I hope that you can come and join us. We have a debate in 2 weeks' time. Can we just have one final thank you to our wonderful... Thank you. Can we have one final thank you to our wonderful speakers, please?